For the first time in the modern history of relations between Canada and the United States, Donald Trump has formally excluded Canada from his international peace initiative. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response arrived in 6 words that brought Washington to a momentary halt. The development was confirmed by the BBC, Reuters, and the New York Times, and the consequences of what follows could permanently alter the shape of North American politics in ways that neither country has previously encountered. To understand how the relationship arrived at this particular moment, the timeline needs to be assembled carefully. The critical date is January 23, 2026, and the action was centered in Washington. The 2 principal figures were President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, a leader who brought to the role the rare distinction of having previously governed both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. Canadians had selected Carney in their election specifically because his economic background was seen as the strongest available foundation for managing what had become an increasingly difficult relationship with the United States. Weeks before the events of January 2026, Trump had introduced what he described as his Board of Peace, a carefully assembled group of international partners intended to assist in mediating global conflicts, including the situation in Gaza. Canada had accepted the invitation to participate, and Carney had publicly committed to playing an active role within that framework. The revocation of that invitation did not arrive without a preceding sequence of events that placed it in clear context. It came directly after a public statement from Carney that carried considerable weight within American political circles. To understand that sequence fully, the timeline must be traced back further than January 2026. On March 28, 2025, President Trump placed a telephone call to Prime Minister Carney. Trump subsequently described the conversation as extremely productive. Reporting confirmed by CBC News revealed that during that phone discussion, Trump raised the possibility of Canada joining the United States as its 51st state. Carney's reply was immediate and unambiguous. He informed the president, in language he later repeated publicly, that Canada is not for sale, not at this moment, and not at any future moment. The conversation did not conclude the matter. The following significant exchange occurred on May 6, 2025, when Carney traveled to Washington and met Trump in person at the Oval Office. Cameras were present for the moment when Trump returned to the 51st state concept and added his now widely repeated phrase that one should never say never. Carney looked directly at the president and responded with words that were quoted extensively across international media. He wanted every word to be registered clearly, and those words were that Canada is not for sale, will not be for sale, and will not be for sale at any point in the future. Detailed reporting from NPR, the New York Times, and the BBC noted that this kind of unambiguous language, delivered by a foreign leader in the Oval Office while cameras were rolling, was notable precisely because it departed from the carefully constructed diplomatic phrasing that such settings typically produce. Carney had selected his words with deliberate intent to eliminate any possibility of misinterpretation. The sequence then advances to the weeks immediately preceding the January 2026 revocation. CNBC reporting from that period documents that Carney had delivered a public address in which he warned explicitly of what he described as a rupture occurring within the American-led global order. He stated that warning on the public record without qualification. Shortly after that speech, President Trump posted the announcement removing Canada's invitation to the Board of Peace. The timing was registered immediately by Reuters, the BBC, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and the New York Times as something more than coincidental. Trump's message was compact and offered no diplomatic elaboration beyond the bare announcement that the Board of Peace was withdrawing its previously extended invitation to Canada. The broader economic environment within which this diplomatic deterioration was occurring had been building in pressure throughout 2025. Early in that year, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariff measures against Canadian exports. The downstream effects were tracked with close attention. A major survey conducted toward the end of 2025 found that the majority of Canadians reported feeling the direct economic impact of those tariffs on both the national economy and their own household finances. The Bank of Canada released a formal report under the title Navigating Tariff Uncertainty, which warned in its own institutional language that the duties were capable of applying downward pressure on Canadian energy producers and reducing their profitability. Canada's Department of Finance issued a complimentary public statement documenting that the tariffs would increase costs for consumers, place thousands of jobs at risk, and weaken the overall competitive position of North America as an economic bloc. The cumulative institutional messaging from Canada's central financial authorities conveyed a picture of genuine and measurable economic damage. The pressure continued to intensify. During the same week as the Board of Peace revocation, Trump threatened to impose tariffs of 100% on all Canadian goods in the event that Canada pursued any trade arrangement involving China. That figure carried specific weight, given that approximately 75% of Canada's total export volume is directed toward the United States. Trump had stated publicly that Canada is entirely dependent on the American market, while the United States does not carry an equivalent dependence on Canada. This structural imbalance in economic exposure formed the underlying foundation of the dispute and defined the leverage each side possessed. An October 2025 working visit by Carney to Washington generated a New York Times headline describing a collision avoided, while noting a damaging comment. Politico reported that Carney stated publicly following that meeting that the overall situation had fundamentally altered how Canadians perceived the United States. CNN confirmed that Carney had entered those discussions without expecting tariff relief and departed without any formal agreement having been reached. Survey data from the Angus Reid Institute, one of Canada's most established and respected polling organizations, found that half of Canadians said the ongoing trade situation made them more inclined to pursue alternative trade partnerships outside the United States. The BBC documented a measurable cultural shift in Canadian attitudes, including a stronger preference for domestically produced goods, reduced appetite for travel to the United States, and broader public support for economic diversification away from American market dependence. These were not marginal findings. They reflected a sustained and deepening shift in how Canadians were relating to the bilateral relationship at the level of everyday personal choices and values. By early March 2026, Prime Minister Carney was not in Washington engaged in bilateral negotiations. He was in India, conducting his first official prime ministerial visit to that country. The Guardian, AP News, the BBC, and Al Jazeera all reported that the central objective of the India trip was to reduce Canada's structural dependence on the American market for its export activity. At the time of the visit, total trade between Canada and India stood at under 15 billion Canadian dollars, a figure that illustrated both the current scale of that relationship and the potential scope for expansion. Carney held direct meetings with Prime Minister Modi, along with business and industry representatives. According to New York Times coverage from February 28th, he was also scheduled to visit Australia and Japan, with the aim of strengthening what the paper described as middle power bonds. In the vocabulary of international relations, the term middle power refers to nations possessing sufficient economic weight and diplomatic standing to influence global systems meaningfully, without holding the capacity to dominate those systems unilaterally. Canada, India, Australia, and Japan together represent a grouping of democratic nations whose coordinated action on trade and economic policy could carry substantial effect with reduced dependence on any single dominant power. Even a modest shift in the proportion of Canadian exports directed away from the American market and toward these alternative partners would represent a structural change in the North American economic landscape that would have appeared unlikely just a few years earlier. The international response to the Board of Peace revocation was itself informative. The Trump administration produced no formal diplomatic statement beyond the original social media post, with no press conference and no guidance issued by the State Department. CNBC characterized the action as a widening of the existing divide between Washington and Ottawa. Within Canada, polling indicated that half the population now actively supported pursuing trade relationships beyond the United States. The BBC observed a measurable cultural reorientation in how Canadians regarded American goods and American tourism. Analysts quoted across multiple international outlets noted that publicly withdrawing a previously accepted diplomatic invitation from a close G7 and NATO ally carries symbolic consequences well beyond the immediate moment. It generates domestic political pressure in the receiving country that makes future accommodation and compromise substantially more difficult to achieve. Analysis pieces appeared in Al Jazeera, Reuters, The Guardian, the BBC, and AFP with a common thread. This was not a routine bilateral disagreement, but a clear strategic repositioning by a major American ally responding to sustained economic and diplomatic pressure. One detail added further complexity to the picture. On February 28, 2026, Carney publicly expressed Canadian support for American military action directed at Iran's nuclear program. Even while trade tensions remained elevated, Canada aligned with Washington on that security matter. Analysts quoted by CBC and The Hill interpreted this alignment as reflecting a deliberate approach of selective engagement. Firm resistance on questions of economic sovereignty, combined with continued cooperation on shared security interests, where alignment remained in Canada's interests. The historical parallel most frequently cited in this context reaches back to 1971, when President Richard Nixon imposed a 10% surcharge on all American imports, including those arriving from Canada, without any prior consultation with Ottawa. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau described the action at the time as a fact of life and began quietly exploring ways to diversify Canada's trade relationships in response. The situation today carries an obvious resemblance to that episode, but with one significant distinction. Nixon's surcharge remained in place for 4 months before being removed. The current tariff measures have now persisted for more than 12 months, with no publicly stated timeline for resolution. Other historical reference points include the 1988 Free Trade Agreement negotiations, which came close to collapse on multiple occasions before both governments found the political will to recognize their mutual economic dependence and conclude a deal. In the USMCA renegotiation of 2018 and 2019, Trump had imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, and Canada responded with reciprocal countermeasures calibrated dollar for dollar. That dispute lasted more than a year before both governments negotiated a resolution. What distinguishes the present period from all of those earlier episodes is the repeated and public suggestion from an American president that Canada could be absorbed into the United States as a territory. No president in the modern era had introduced that idea into the relationship in this way. That rhetorical development has altered the political calculations in Ottawa at a fundamental level, making straightforward trade resolutions structurally harder to achieve, because any concession by Carney now risks being interpreted domestically as a step toward the sovereignty outcome that Canadians have rejected. Repeated polling inside Canada shows that Carney's emphasis on economic sovereignty enjoys strong and sustained domestic support. Each public restatement of that position appears to reinforce or strengthen his standing at home, which in turn constrains how much negotiating flexibility he can credibly offer in any future discussions with Washington. Inside the United States, the Canada relationship remains a secondary consideration for most voters, and this imbalance in political attention creates its own category of risk. decisions made in Washington may not consistently account for the long-term consequences for the overall bilateral partnership in the way that a more symmetrical political relationship might require. The annual trade relationship between the two countries is valued at approximately $800 billion and features supply chain integration of exceptional depth, particularly in the automotive sector, where components cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle is completed. Any sustained disruption to that integration produces costs for manufacturers, workers, and consumers on both sides of the border simultaneously. Trade law experts cited in Canadian media have assessed that several of the current tariff measures may conflict with obligations the United States carries under the USMCA, and Canada has already filed formal challenges at the World Trade Organization, though those processes typically require years to produce outcomes, while economic costs accumulate in real time. What Carney is pursuing through his visits to India, Australia, and Japan extends beyond the immediate goal of trade volume diversification. In international relations terms, it represents the early construction of an alternative coordination framework among democratic nations that carry meaningful economic weight and that can operate with reduced dependence on American-led priorities. Should that framework develop real substance, it would mark a significant departure from the post-1945 pattern in which democratic allies tended to align their strategic orientations automatically with American preferences. The next 30 days will provide early evidence of whether the pivot is substantive. Framework agreements or memoranda of understanding emerging from Carney's current tour of India, Australia, and Japan will offer the first concrete indication of whether this strategic repositioning is producing real architecture or remains primarily at the level of political signaling. Within the following 90 days, the scheduled joint review of the USMCA will take place, a process that was always expected to be demanding, but that now occurs against the backdrop of the most strained bilateral relationship between the two countries in living memory. One possible path forward involves the Trump administration using the USMCA review as an opportunity to scale back the most severe tariff measures in exchange for Canadian commitments on energy pricing or border security arrangements, allowing both sides to declare a form of success and return the relationship to a functional, if damaged, state. A more difficult trajectory would see the tariffs remain, the threat of 100% duties carried out, and Canada's alternative coalition gaining substantive momentum. In that case, even foundational cooperative arrangements including NORAD and the Five Eyes intelligence partnership could begin experiencing friction as political trust continues to erode. The two countries, despite sharing the world's longest undefended border and decades of deeply integrated economic and security relationships, could begin a gradual structural drift toward decoupling, whose effects would be measured not in immediate costs, but in decades of changed assumptions about North American stability and partnership.